I have pictures here, and I've showed this in a previous series on the material we did on revival. Here are some drawings of children working in the coal mines in the 1800s, where they had to push these coal wagons along, and the whole point of this, they said that they had to do it. Adults said that the children had to do it because they're the only ones whose bones were still flexible enough before they set to be able to get through these mines. So you can imagine being put in a mine. The simplest job was a little job called a trapper's job. And what you did is they lowered you down a hole, pitch black. You'd take an adult and lower him down a hole, pitch black, 50 feet underground, with mud and running water and beetles and rats and other things. Sits there in the dark. He had to sit behind a door and wait for these coal cars, children pushing, to come up, because if there was a gas explosion, then it only killed the people between those doors. The doors cut the gas off from going further on. So those doors had to be kept closed. They'd open them, coal car went through, and they'd close them behind. So they sat in the dark, sometimes 18 to 20 hours a day, sitting there in the mud, listening. Now, an adult, you imagine, I'll put you in one of those things for an hour and think how you feel. You imagine a little kid of 7 or 8 years old, lowered down into that hole every single day. Some went crazy. Some went completely crazy. And that was the mildest job. There was terrible cruelty. It says, in addition to the actual labor, the children, especially the apprentices, suffered terribly from the cruelty of the overlookers, who bargained for them, dismissed them, and used them as they pleased. You can see many of the people, a large proportion of the workers underground were less than 13 years of age. Some of them began toil in the pits when only 4 or 5, many between 6 and 7, and the majority not over 8 or 9, females as well as males. Except on Sunday, they never saw the sun. There were no hours of relaxation. Their meals were mostly eaten in the dark, and their homes were with parents who devoted them to this kind of life. Here's what hurrying, that is loading small wagons called corbs with coal and pushing along passage, was an utterly barbarous labor performed by women as well as by children. They had to crawl on hands and knees, draw enormous weights along shafts as narrow and wet as common sewers, and women remained at this work till the last hour of pregnancy. When the passages were very narrow, not more than 18 to 24 inches in height, boys and girls performed the work by girdle and chain. That is to say, a girdle was put around the naked waist, to which a chain from the carriage was hooked and passed between the legs, and crawling on hands and knees, they drew the carriages after them. It is not necessary to describe how the sides of the hurriers were blistered, their ankles strained, how their backs were chafed by coming in contact with the roofs, or how they stumbled in the darkness and choked in the stifling atmosphere. It is enough to say they were obliged to do the work of horses or other beasts of burden only because human flesh and blood was cheaper in some cases, and horse labor was impossible in others. Coal bearing, carrying on their backs on unrailroaded roads, burdens weighing from half a hundredweight to a hundredweight and a half, was almost always performed by girls and women, and it was a common occurrence for little children at the age of 6 or 7 years to carry burdens of coal of half a hundredweight up steps that in the aggregate equaled an ascent 14 times a day to the summit of St. Paul's Cathedral, which is like climbing up to, I don't know, halfway up the Empire State and back again. And you can read these other things here. What happened in in this 1800s then, this is not so long ago, is it? Is that there was no childhood. And you know what gave childhood back? Christian revival. The preaching of the gospel in society gave children back their childhood and established those norms that this society is now busy throwing out again. It was the Christian picture of family that brought childhood back. And I mentioned the Booths, and you'll see that in the little book Revival, how that Bramwell Booth and his wife, who had a little girl themselves undercovered this hideous initiation entrapment process and laboured. In those days in moral Britain, I think the age of consent was like 14 or 15 or something, and one Minister of Parliament wanted it lowered to 12, or it was 12 and he wanted it lowered to 10 or some ridiculous thing. And one man boasted that he'd ruined 2,000 children. That was in moral Britain. And the Salvation Army went to war against this damnable thing. And what they did is they had a newspaper editor. He was a guy like the editor of the National Enquirer, you know, some well-read paper across the... And he happened to be a Christian. This guy was sort of the local, it's called the Pall Mall Gazette. It was the basic thing everybody read for whatever was going on. And he posed as a child procureur. And they bought this pretty child from the parents for £10 or something ridiculous. And he went all the way, they documented each step of the process, right up to the point where normally the procureur would have sexual intercourse with this child that he'd bought. And then they published the story. And it hit London like no other piece of news has ever hit London in 100 years. And in less than 2 months, this bill, which 3 times had been thrown out of Parliament, was law. They raised the age of consent up to 16. The continent was 21. But in Britain, it was like 12 or something ridiculous. And pushed it back up again. Salvation Army marched into Parliament with this huge roll that had 160,000 signatures on it. It was, you know, just shocked Parliament. And it was Christian awakening and Christian concern that gave children back their childhood.